Gravel shifted under boots as the range stirred awake before sunrise at Fort Sterling, Colorado. Each breath drifted into the cold as pale mist, and red-covered headlamps flickered like tiny stars while the steel target sat far out in the dark, barely more than shapes against the earth. Rifles waited in their cases, heavy and still, as if the day itself would decide who deserved to stand there and who didn't. One male candidate stopped at the roster board, sliding a finger down the list until he found her name. His mouth twitched into a crooked grin as he leaned toward the man beside him and muttered, "Didn't she fail out last time?" There was no loud laugh in return, just a sharp, low sound that slipped down the line and landed exactly where it could cut deepest. She didn't lift her eyes. Lena knelt by her rifle case, checking the latches twice, then a third time, slow and precise, like her entire world existed in those small motions. An instructor's stare rested on her for half a heartbeat, unreadable, and then drifted away as if she were already a problem better left untouched. Before we get going, make sure you're subscribed to Major Tom's Tales so you never miss these true stories of grit, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from today. Her name was Staff Sergeant Lena Marlowe, 28 years old, an infantry squad leader in the United States Army. She stood on that firing line with the same stance she used in front of her own soldiers back home. Shoulders squared, chin steady, weight centered like she carried responsibility instead of nerves. This moment wasn't random for her. The sniper course had hovered on her horizon for years, requested, denied, requested again, postponed by deployments and unit demands, finally approved only after she'd stopped believing it would happen at all. When the orders arrived, she didn't celebrate. She folded the paper once, tucked it away, and went right back to work as if the real exam had already begun. To most of the candidates around her, she didn't seem like someone to worry about. She was smaller than most of the men there, not delicate, just compact, built more for endurance than intimidation. When she did speak, her voice stayed calm and even, never rising to match the noise of the louder personalities filling the cold morning with jokes and bragging. She didn't join their circle. While they leaned on each other and laughed too loudly at nothing, Lena remained just outside their orbit, tightening straps, checking gear, scanning faces quietly. That distance only fueled their doubts. Silence, to people who depend on noise to feel confident, can look a lot like weakness. And then there was the rumor, the story that clung to her name like a shadow. Someone always knew someone who swore they remembered. She got dropped last time, they whispered like it was a stain that never faded. Same course, same ground. A quiet failure sharp enough to hurt without needing details. 6 years earlier, she'd stood on another range as Specialist Lena Marlowe, quicker to prove herself, quicker to push too hard, and far less patient. Back then, pride sat too close to the surface, and she believed that sheer effort would be enough. The course tore that belief apart piece by piece. Her failure hit during a stressful range estimation event. The ticking clock felt louder than her own pulse. The instructors seemed closer than they were, and the radio cracked alive with news she was never meant to hear. Her mentor from her home unit had been hit overseas by an IED, alive, but shattered. Her focus slipped for a heartbeat. One heartbeat was all the course ever needed. Her numbers wandered. Her solution fell apart. By the time she turned in her card, she already knew. The cadre didn't shout, they didn't argue, just quiet, and the weight of understanding settling on her shoulders. They didn't argue. One of them simply looked at her with a worn, straight-on expression and said, "Not ready." No ceremony followed, no lecture to soften it, no comfort to hold on to. Just the cold realization that she had failed herself at the exact moment she believed she had no room for failure. She packed her gear without a word and walked away, convinced she might never step onto that ground again. What came next wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quieter than most stories people call redemption. She returned to her line unit and asked for nothing out of the ordinary. She took point when assigned, fell in behind when she wasn't, and stopped talking about goals altogether, choosing instead to notice the details she once overlooked. Late at night, while others slept, she pored over wind charts and ballistic tables until the numbers felt like another language. She learned to read mirage the way a farmer reads the sky. She sought out older marksmen, men past the age of bragging, men who knew enough to be humble, and asked them to teach her what they wished someone had taught them sooner. When extra range hours came up and everyone else groaned about losing rest time, she volunteered. When drills dragged on too long, she stayed focused. Her urgency slowly gave way to humility, and frustration evolved into discipline. She realized that patience wasn't waiting around. It was preparation in disguise. Quiet habits began to follow her everywhere, little signs only attentive people would catch. Her left thumb often brushed the spot where a wedding band might have rested, tracing a faint mark on her skin even though she wore no ring. When she adjusted her sling, she always retightened one buckle until it lay perfectly flat. Not for comfort, but because uneven pressure pulled at her focus. Her voice stayed low even in stressful moments. She didn't rush to fill empty space. She listened longer than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was usually to correct something, not to draw attention. The social terrain around her was already shaping itself. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate moved between candidates with the look of a man who had seen every version of confidence and collapse this course ever produced. He wasted no breath on padding his words. Instructions came out like simple facts rather than encouragement. Sergeant Kyle Mercer existed on the other end of that spectrum. Loud laugh, proud shooter, quick to size himself up against others, and even quicker to dismiss anything he didn't understand. Lena's calm unsettled him, and that unease leaked out through sharp remarks and casual digs. Specialist Ethan Vargas watched Lena differently. Younger, unsure, he studied her the way someone drowning studies a person who somehow stays afloat. He didn't step in when others mocked her, but his eyes followed her movements, searching for whatever steadiness she carried. Corporal Owen Radford, the British exchange soldier, kept a bit of distance from the group. He moved with a quiet, deliberate composure, choosing professionalism over joining any jokes, and deliberately avoiding getting pulled into the noise. When the order to move came down the line, Lena crouched for a moment and opened a small field notebook. She wrote a single short line, tight, private, then closed it and tucked it away. When she rose, nothing in her posture shifted. It wasn't a hope. It was a promise she intended to hold. The Day 1 briefing hall smelled of aged plywood, stale coffee, and uniforms drying far too slowly. Candidates squeezed into folding chairs, knees nearly touching. Notebooks open as they tried to appear more prepared than they felt, while nerves hummed through the room. Master Sergeant Tate stepped to the front, clasped his hands behind his back, and stared at them like he was already tallying the problems they'd become. His voice came out flat, almost uninterested, which somehow made every word hit harder. "Most of you will fail," he told them, and he said it with the same tone someone uses to announce tomorrow's weather. He explained that failure wouldn't arrive with drama or some loud meltdown. It would slip in quietly, your name crossed off a list, your pride left behind without ceremony. When he mentioned washouts, Sergeant Kyle Mercer shifted in his chair and shot a quick glance toward Lena, his jaw tightening like he had just received confirmation of something he wanted to believe. Outside, the first real test hit before anyone had a chance to grow confident. A timed ruck march shoved them straight into a cold wind that cut through fabric and went straight to the skin. The world narrowed to boots, breathing, and the steady pull of weight. Lena stayed in the middle of the pack, not chasing the men up front, not slipping behind, moving with the controlled effort of someone who knew panic wasted more energy than it saved. Her shoulders stayed level. Her pace stayed honest. She passed one man who had burned himself out too early, now struggling for air and shaking. Mercer eased up beside her on purpose, matching her pace just long enough to make it feel like a challenge. He looked from her boots to her face and said loudly, "That's that admin's strong pace right there." A few guys chuckled because it was the easy thing to do. Lena didn't respond. She kept her eyes ahead and let the wind steal the sound away. The course wasn't interested in offering comfort. The stalking lane practice began beneath a dull gray sky, the ground soaked from earlier rain. Candidates crawled on their bellies through wet grass and gritty sand, elbows digging deep, dirt working its way into every seam of their uniforms. Their hearts pounded so loudly it felt like each beat echoed across the field. Most of them rushed. They tried to conquer the lane with speed, and speed betrayed them. A head rose too high. A knee lifted at the wrong moment. A clump of grass shivered when it should have stayed still. Spotters caught them instantly, calling them out with brutal certainty. Lena moved differently. She went slow, patient, as if the clock meant nothing to her. She treated the ground like it belonged to her, slipping into shadows, pausing when the wind shifted, waiting for the spotter's attention to drift. She didn't fight the terrain, she listened to it. A spotter on a raised platform leaned toward another and whispered, "Surprised. How is she that quiet?" The words weren't meant for candidates, but they traveled anyway. A few heads turned. A few smirks faded. Later came the range estimation drills, the kind that exposed arrogance and punished hopeful guessing. Steel targets sat scattered across the open field, distances chosen to trick the eye. Heat shimmer twisted the air, and mirage danced over the dirt, bending reality just enough to embarrass anyone too confident. Mercer wanted an audience. He jabbed a finger at a distant target and called out, "Hey Marlowe, call that distance, let's hear it." His tone held a smile with no kindness in it, the kind that waited for a mistake to pounce. Other candidates looked up from their cards, curious, eager for someone else to slip. Lena didn't take the bait. She paused, wrote her estimate quietly, then studied the mirage again, watching how it drifted and thickened, how the air seemed to breathe. She made a small correction, then handed over her number like she was reporting something routine. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate glanced at her card and moved on. No praise, no smile, but no correction either. And in that room, that silence meant something. Mercer stared at Tate's back like he wanted to protest, then scoffed and acted like it didn't bother him. The jab that followed came later in the chow line when exhaustion sharpened everyone's edges. Metal trays clattered, the smell of overcooked food hung thick, and the hum of tired conversations floated around the room. A candidate Lena barely knew stepped into her space, just close enough to challenge her, and said, "You washed out once. What makes you think you belong here now?" He didn't raise his voice. It was worse than that. It sounded like a truth everyone else had quietly agreed on. The line fell silent, slow and heavy. Even the ones who had laughed earlier stopped chewing. Even Mercer turned to watch, waiting for entertainment. Lena kept her tray steady. Her hands stayed still. She met the man's eyes not with anger but with a calm that refused to bend. "I'm here because my unit needs me ready," she said. Nothing more. No story, no justification. Just duty laid out like a barrier he couldn't cross. "What would you have done?" with a room full of strangers staring at your past like it was a sentence. Nightland navigation followed, and the course stripped away the kind of confidence that only survives in daylight. The forest swallowed every sound. The darkness pressed in. Headlamps carved small circles that felt too fragile against the trees. The air grew colder as the sun slipped away, and the thin glow of headlamps carved soft circles that felt too fragile to push back the dark. Whispers drifted between candidates as they stepped off. Rumors about who was already falling behind, who had gotten turned around, who was quietly losing their nerve. Someone muttered that the course was built to humble people. Someone else argued it was built to expose them. Lena moved with deliberate rhythm, counting her steps like they were a pulse she trusted. She checked terrain features, compared tree lines to the map, and refused to rush even when she felt her time shrinking. Once, she stopped completely, listened to the wind brushing through branches, then shifted her azimuth by a few degrees, as if she were nudging the world into alignment. She returned with seconds to spare, mud streaked on her knees, breathing steady. She handed over her card without searching for a reaction. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate accepted it with the same flat look he gave everyone, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer. Mercer showed up late. He stormed into the checkpoint hot and irritated, blaming the route, blaming the darkness, blaming anything except his own decisions. He talked loudly enough to drown out his discomfort, and a few candidates nodded because blame spreads easily when nerves are fraying. The next morning, the tension cinched tighter. Tate announced that a graded unknown distance shoot would happen earlier than expected. The news hit the room like cold water. Unknown distance meant you couldn't lean on memory or comfort. You had to stay calm while pride begged you to rush. Rumor flared instantly because fear always needs fuel. "She's going to fail again," someone whispered, and that familiar hook pulled at every ear. A few laughs tried to spark, but the sound died thin. Soon, the room settled into watchful quiet, even among those who had hoped to see her stumble. People began to wonder what it would mean if she didn't. Would you have spoken up for her, or stayed silent like the rest? That night, when the barracks finally sagged into exhausted quiet, Lena stayed awake a little longer. She sat alone under a weak overhead light, the kind that makes everything look worn, and laid out her rifle parts in careful rows. The cleaning cloth moved in slow, steady arcs. Oil caught the dim glow before disappearing into the metal. Her hands remained calm even as fatigue tugged at her features. She blinked hard once, jaw tightening for a brief moment, then relaxed. Her posture never slouched. She finished the job as if it mattered more than sleep, and for her it did. When she closed the case, the latches snapped shut with the same quiet finality as her breath. And suddenly, the room felt less like a crowded barracks, and more like a challenge she intended to outlast. The next morning, a cadre member sorted through data cards with the detachment of someone who had seen thousands. When he reached Lena's, he hesitated. The edges were soft, worn the way only old cards get. Pencil marks overlapped in layers, more like a history book than fresh work. It didn't look like classroom practice. It looked like something that had been carried through real places under real pressure. He glanced her way once before sliding it back into the pile. Later, while she adjusted her kit before another lane, her sleeve lifted just enough to reveal a thin scar on her left wrist. Faded, healed, clean. The kind of mark that stopped asking for attention years ago. Specialist Ethan Vargas noticed as he passed behind her, his eyes catching for a heartbeat longer than politeness allowed. He looked away immediately, embarrassed, like he'd glimpsed something he had no right to witness. Lena didn't acknowledge it. She simply pulled her sleeve down and tightened her strap, smooth and practiced. The scar vanished, leaving behind only the impression that her story stretched far deeper than the course would ever measure. During a short break, she opened her ruck to grab a notebook, and something inside shifted. Tucked deep beneath spare socks and a folded poncho liner was a small, faded patch. No bright colors, no dramatic symbol, just a worn piece of fabric kept close the way someone carries a photo they never show. She noticed Vargas nearby and angled the ruck so the patch stayed hidden. Not out of shame, out of habit, the instinct built when memories are meant to be carried quietly, not explained. At the live fire brief, the atmosphere tightened again. Weapons were cleared and rechecked, instructors calling out procedures with ritual precision. Instructors recited safety steps with ritual precision, each point delivered like a practiced mantra. As one cadre member moved down the checklist, he fumbled a phrase just slightly, enough for anyone with real range time to catch it. Under her breath, barely louder than a thought, Lena corrected him using the exact wording a combat range safety NCO would use. Not showy, not sharp, perfectly timed to stop a mistake before it started. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate flicked his eyes toward her, quick and sharp, then back to the formation. He didn't pause the briefing or call attention to it, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted like a detail he'd been missing had just fallen into place. Between lanes, two instructors huddled close, pretending to review notes while keeping their voices low. "Marlowe," one muttered, watching the field. "Isn't she the one from 3rd Battalion?" The other shook his head. Different Marlowe, or maybe not. Their words cut off instantly when Boots approached, swallowed before the thought could finish. Lena walked past without slowing, without glancing their way, without pretending she hadn't heard her own name carried on their breath. She moved as though the comment belonged to someone else entirely. Later that afternoon, during a quick break meant for water and notes, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She'd forgotten it was there. The signal was weak, but the screen lit just long enough to reveal a missed voicemail. One message, old date, still saved. She stepped away from the others, using a vehicle door as cover, and unlocked the screen. The sender's name appeared, familiar enough to tighten something deep in her chest. She stared at it for a long second, thumb hovering over the play button. Around her, the course continued without mercy. Instructors shouted times. Steel clanged on another lane. Someone laughed nervously, the sound dying mid-breath. Lena's breathing slowed, measured, bracing against an internal pull she never showed. She didn't press play. Instead, she locked the phone and slipped it back into her pocket, sealing the moment away like she always did. Whatever lived in that message wasn't for this place. She returned to the line with her face composed and her eyes forward. To everyone else, she was just another candidate preparing for the next task. But the signs were piling up, quiet, easy to miss, impossible to ignore. Somewhere between the worn edges of her data card and the voicemail she refused to revisit, a deeper story waited, unfinished. The partner exercise was announced without emotion, names called like items on a supply list. When Lena heard hers followed by Specialist Ethan Vargas, she felt the tension radiate from him before she even looked. Vargas swallowed hard, his gaze jumping from her to the range and back again, his hands fidgeting in small, anxious movements. Behind them, Sergeant Kyle Mercer let out a short laugh that carried farther than he meant. "That's rough," he said to no one in particular, loud enough for several to hear. "Guess she's getting dragged down by a weak link today." A few candidates offered uneasy smiles, unsure whether to join in or pretend the comment hadn't landed. Lena didn't react. She caught Vargas's eyes and gave a small, grounding nod, steadying rather than commanding. He nodded back too quickly, a mix of gratitude and fear in the motion. The stalk began under the constant gaze of instructors and spotters. Almost immediately, Vargas's breathing spiked. His movements turned sharp, rushed, elbows digging deep, grass bending where it shouldn't. Lena lifted her hand, closing her fingers slowly in a signal that meant stop. Vargas froze, chest heaving, eyes wide. She waited, patient, until his breath settled enough for him to hear the wind again. Her attention stayed fixed not on him, but on the terrain ahead, like the ground itself carried the next step. She leaned close, voice barely above a whisper, guiding instead of correcting. No lectures, no frustration, just quiet direction, when to move, when to pause, how to match the spotter's scan instead of fighting their rhythm. They advanced only when the range allowed it, not when panic tried to shove them forward. Pauses stretched longer than they felt. Sweat cooled on their backs. Someone nearby was called out and pulled from the lane, the sound echoing like a warning. Lena never rushed. She let the silence soften Vargas's panic into focus. When they finally reached the firing position, his hands trembled as he sat up, the rifle feeling suddenly heavier now that success was within reach. Fear of failure pressed in close, tightening his breath until it turned shallow, the kind that steals precision. Lena didn't touch his rifle. She didn't adjust his optic or edge him aside. She stayed next to him, voice steady, calm enough to borrow. "Breathe," she said, waiting as his shoulders eased. "Settle," she added, watching the reticle stop drifting. Then, after a moment that felt earned, "Press." The shot broke clean. Steel rang across the range, a clear, undeniable hit. No applause followed. The spotter called it flatly, but heads turned all the same. Vargas blinked in disbelief before looking at Lena with raw relief softening his features. She gave him a quick, small nod, nothing more. The moment belonged to him, not her. When her turn came, Lena settled into place with the same steady calm she had carried all day. She built her position carefully, checked her natural point of aim, and watched the mirage as if it were retelling a story she already understood. The wind shifted, subtle but real, and she adjusted without a hint of fuss. Her first round struck the target cleanly. No correction, no hesitation. She didn't react. She simply called the new wind for the next shooter, her tone as casual as if she were reading off the time of day. From behind the line, Kyle Mercer let out a scoffing breath, irritation sharpening his voice. "Lucky day," he muttered, trying to reclaim the moment for himself, trying to shrink her precision into something random. Lena didn't turn around. She didn't raise her voice. "Luck doesn't keep a rifle steady," she said, flat and final, not harsh, just true. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. For a moment, nobody spoke, and the range felt like the air itself had shifted. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate stepped closer, eyes moving from Lena's data to her rifle, then to the Mirage downrange. He knelt beside her position, following her dope with a finger that missed nothing. "Where'd you learn to read Mirage like that?" he asked. Not accusing, not impressed, just the curious tone of someone recognizing an unexpected skill. Lena paused. A tiny hesitation crossed her face like a door she considered opening, then decided against. "From mistakes," she answered softly. Tate studied her for another heartbeat, then rose and moved on without commentary. But the shift had already happened. The way people looked at her changed. Jokes quieted. Conversations dipped when she walked by. By the time the next rotation rolled in, the whisper had flipped. It wasn't about her failing again, it was something different now, voiced carefully. Why does she look like she's done this when it mattered? The laughter that once chased her name faded. Even the loud candidates measured their words as if weighing wind calls. Respect didn't fall on her suddenly. It crept in slowly, uneasy and real, replacing certainty with curiosity. Indeed, Lena felt it building, but she didn't fuel it. She kept her focus where it belonged. On the rifle, the terrain, the next problem to solve. Whatever they thought they were starting to understand, she wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. The graded unknown distance evaluation drew a different kind of attention. Word spread fast when a senior leader arrived, his boots sounding heavier on gravel, his presence alone straightening spines. Command Sergeant Major Victor Hale stepped onto the range with the quiet authority of a man whose reputation had been earned across multiple deployments, the kind of leader who didn't need medals or speeches to be recognized. Everything about him was old school. Uniform plain, movements deliberate, eyes sharp but patient. The cadre gave him space without being told. The candidates felt the change instantly. This wasn't a show inspection. This was someone who understood exactly what the course measured. Hale walked the line slowly, stopping here and there to study a posture or a setup. He barely spoke, letting silence do the work. When he reached Lena, his eyes paused on her name tape, then rose to her face. Something shifted, small, like a memory surfacing. For the first time in the entire course, someone looked at her like she was more than a number on a roster. He studied her longer than protocol required. The range noise dropped. Conversations thinning as if people sensed something important was happening. "Marlowe," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight without force. "Were you at Warden Province, winter rotation, 6 years ago?" The question struck exactly where all the unspoken hints had been pointing. Lena didn't look around to see who was listening. She didn't brace herself. She simply met his eyes and said, "Yes, Sergeant Major." Hale's posture shifted, not dramatically but unmistakably to anyone who knew rank and experience. His shoulders eased. His expression softened, not in pity but in recognition. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only a few could hear. "You were the one who stayed on glass after your team leader went down," he said. It wasn't a question, it was memory. Lena didn't rush to correct him. She didn't shift the credit or explain the details. She just let the truth sit between them. She answered with a single small nod, controlled, restrained, a quiet acknowledgement without claiming anything more than the truth. Around them, the range fell into a silence that had nothing to do with rank. The usual backdrop of competition noise simply evaporated. No laughter, no side comments. Even Kyle Mercer stood motionless, staring downrange like he'd just realized he'd been standing too close to something he never really understood. Command Sergeant Major Victor Hale straightened, giving Lena one final look filled with years of recognition compressed into a heartbeat. Then he moved on, boots crunching softly as the course resumed around him. But the silence he left behind stayed, heavy, deliberate, undeniable, and from that moment forward, the entire day felt different. The range settled into a quieter kind of quiet, the kind born from awareness rather than authority. The candidates who had mocked her before no longer met her eyes, not out of fear, but because something heavier than embarrassment had replaced their earlier confidence. Shame lived in the small things now, the way conversations paused as she walked by, the way heads dipped slightly. Specialist Ethan Vargas looked at her with a new understanding. It wasn't admiration, it was clarity. He finally realized that her calm wasn't a quirk or an act. It was something forged under pressure long before this course tried to measure it. Without thinking, he straightened his own posture, mirroring the discipline he'd seen in her all week. Even Mercer grew quiet. No apology, no explanation, just the collapse of the certainty he had been clinging to, leaving him unsure where to stand. When the final evaluation was called, the quiet held steady. Unknown distance steel waited far across the range, targets scattered intentionally to punish guessing and reward patience. The wind shifted just enough to betray anyone who rushed. Time was tight. Ammunition was limited. There would be no second chances. Lena settled into position without rushing. She laid out her gear exactly the way she always did, each piece placed with deliberate thought. She checked her natural point of aim twice. She studied the mirage through her optic, not hunting for perfect answers but listening for consistency in the air. Around her, others hustled, adjusting their setups too often, whispering numbers like half-formed prayers. Lena stayed still. She built her firing solution piece by piece, letting the environment speak before she acted. When her turn came, the farthest target remained, the one the cadre called the Reach, the shot that had ended more careers than it had crowned. The steel plate looked impossibly small against the land, mirage twisting its edges, wind bending the truth between shooter and target. Lena didn't rush. She watched the mirage roll left, then soften. She felt the breeze shift across the grass against her cheek, subtle but real. She made a single correction, small and confident, the kind built from experience rather than raw calculation. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed to reticle and rhythm. She pressed the trigger the same way she had pressed it when the stakes were life, not points. The steel rang late, delayed by distance, but clean and unmistakable, echoing across the range like a verdict. For a moment, no one moved. A cadre member checked the recording board, frowned, checked it again. He wrote something down, hesitated, and looked up. New course record. No one cheered. No congratulations burst out. The moment didn't want noise. It settled over the group like something sacred, something you didn't break with sound. Command Sergeant Major Hale lifted his hand and offered a single salute, short, precise, carrying far more weight than applause ever could. Master Sergeant Rowan Tate followed with a small nod, the kind given only when respect is no longer in question. The range stayed silent, and in that silence, Lena Marlowe remained exactly who she had been from the start. When the line finally cleared and the range seemed to take its first full breath of the day, Kyle Mercer waited until everyone else drifted away. He walked up without his usual noise, hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes steady but stripped of the bravado he wore like armor. "I was wrong," he said. No excuses trailed behind it. No attempt to soften the truth. Just the words, plain and bare. Lena studied him for a moment, not deciding whether to forgive, but whether the moment itself held weight. "Make it useful," she said, her voice steady. "Teach the next person better than you treated me." Mercer nodded once, sharper than before, like the message hit exactly where it needed to. Then he stepped back, quieter than she had ever seen him. Later, away from the range and all the watchful eyes, Lena sat on the edge of her bunk. Dust from the day clung to her sleeves. She took out her phone, unlocked it, and let her thumb hover where it had paused earlier. This time, she pressed play. The voice that filled the small space was gentle, worn, familiar. Morgan, her former team leader's spouse. There was no drama in the message, only gratitude shaped by old wounds. Morgan thanked her for staying that night, for holding the line, for bringing him home even though the injuries he survived would end his career. She said the kids still asked about the soldier who never left their father's side. Lena listened without moving. Her eyes filled quietly, the way they always did when grief arrived without sound. She wiped them quickly, not out of shame, but out of the habit soldiers learn early. Sorrow waits in corners, patient and silent. She locked the phone again and sat still for another moment, letting the memory settle without letting it overflow. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't demand an audience. Discipline rarely looks impressive while it's happening, and humility never tries to outshine the room. Most real strength works quietly, fixing the little things, choosing patience over pride, returning to places that once cut deep. Some people come back for revenge. Others return for acknowledgement. The strongest come back because they are needed, because readiness matters more than recognition, and because unfinished work doesn't disappear just because it once hurt. Lena Marlowe didn't leave that range changed by applause or a new record. She walked away exactly as she had arrived, carrying responsibility forward rather than trophies behind her. The course had measured distance and wind, but what it revealed was something older and harder to teach. Respect should show up long before the record does. She folded her data book with the same quiet care she'd shown all week and slid it into her pocket without ceremony. She stepped off the range with the same even stride, shoulders level, posture unchanged by achievement. From a distance, she looked exactly as she had that first morning. Steady, quiet, already prepared for whatever came next. Stories like hers remind us how often silence is mistaken for weakness. The person overlooked today, the one dismissed or underestimated, may be the very one who steadies the entire team when pressure pushes in and there's no room left for noise. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Major Tom's Tales for more military and veteran stories, because these stories keep courage alive for the generations who follow.